Good afternoon, guys. Got a 2021 Rubicon foot shift. We're about to put a 40% and some stage 1 springs in.
We got the floorboards off the skid pan. We drained the oil, 17mm bolt under here. Now we're going to take, you got to take these 2 rubber boots loose to be able to pull we're going to pull this front diff forward and release this drive shaft. So you need to get these boots up out of the way, and that'll allow you to, this shaft is spring loaded here. So they've got a O-ring, 2 rubber O-rings. They're using those like clamps on these boots. I'll take a pick and get those off. And then you'll be able to slide this boot back. You want to just slide it all into the middle like that. There's the back one. Do the same thing on the front one. Because the boots will keep you from being able to collapse the shaft enough. Just be careful not you don't break those O-rings. You can break them. I mean, they'll stretch some, but not a whole lot. Just try to get that boot popped off. So we got both our boots loose. And now that'll allow us to get a pry bar, and you'll see this thing is spring loaded. Sometimes they're kind of tight. There's an O-ring in here, but now what we need to do is get the front diff loose so we can pull it forward to finish getting this off of this output shaft. Alright, come up here. There's you got 2 12mm bolts that holds this bracket to the frame. Then you got a 14 mounting bolt there that goes through the diff on the front, and then there's one on the bottom toward the back under here. That's what's bolting, holding the diff in the frame. Like here to this side, I'm gonna grab that wrench.
Of course, you can use air tools or battery power tools. We're just going to do it with hand tools, just to show you that you don't have to have air tools.
So that's loose. Take these 2 12s loose here. You have to get this bracket out of the way to be able to get the diff to move forward. I got a cupcake pan, and I put different places to keep the bolts together in their own little groups in that cupcake pan. See, we got a cupcake pan here where our bolts organized. Throw it up through the frame, and you can get it on the bolt head right there, just like that. If it's turned right, there you go, just like that. Come right here and get on the nut this side. If you're careful, that wrench will stay on the bolt head, and it'll catch on the frame, so you don't have to hold the wrench. So the diff should be loose now at this point, so you can kind of move it around. That bottom bolt's longer than the front one, so you can't really get them mixed up. Now, what you want to do, you got to pull the diff forward. You need a pry bar. We got a long pry bar here. But what's going to happen is you've got to turn the tie rod in is going to interfere with you moving that diff forward. So what you want to do is move your handlebars, steer to the right, like that, to give you some room. And we're going to take this pry bar and just kind of go in here pick up on this diff. And kind of push it forward. Like that. See how far forward it went? Should be able to get the output shaft off. Sometimes it's easier if you got somebody to help you kind of pull the diff while you're pulling on the shaft. Alright, so you've got an O-ring on here that goes on that shaft. We're going to take it off once we get this out of the way. Alright, see how that came right off? Now you want to take this whole shaft. I take the whole shaft out of the diff as an assembly. You may want to take the, sometimes it's easier to take that sleeve off, give you a little bit more room. Just slide that back on. That's how you want to take that off. Just like that. Now we're going to take this O-ring off of this output shaft. You don't want to pull, which we're going to replace that seal, but it can mess the seal up if you try to pull it over there with the O-ring still on the shaft. Alright, now we're going to undo this big coolant line here. What I do is I clamp my lines off so I don't lose a lot of coolant. You're just going to lose what's in the motor pretty much. So I use some vice grips to clamp the lines off. I'm going to take this big line off the front of the water pump. And we're going to take this small line off. I've got a 10mm bolt I'm going to stick in the end of this small hose when I pull it off to kind of keep it from dripping. And then we clamp this upper hose off that comes out of the thermostat housing on the top of the engine. It goes to the radiator. We're going to clamp it off also to keep the coolant from trying to fall back through the engine. That line off, we clamped the other top line off over here on the other side. And I've got this clamp loose on this small hose to pull it off the water pump. So you can drain, if you don't want to make a real big mess, this bottom bolt has a copper washer on it. That's how you drain the water pump and the engine, whatever coolant's sitting inside the engine. So I broke that loose, and it's going to sit there and drain whatever coolant is basically in between where we clamped off at. I always like to get it loose enough that I can slide it over that. These hoses get stuck onto these nipples, so you'll have to kind of twist it, and you may have to get a flathead screwdriver to go in between there and kind of pry it off. Be easy with it. I've got a drain. Basically all that's inside the engine is draining out right now. So we'll go ahead and try to get this smaller hose off. Work it off the same way I did that big one, like that. So I'm gonna just plug it. That's a 10mm bolt I got stuck in there. You'll just want to kind of bend this out of the way. So I'd go ahead and tighten this 10. This is a 10mm. Tighten it back up. Now we're ready to take the bolts that's holding the cover on. The cover's ready to come off at this point. So you got these 10mm bolts that's around the circumference of the cover. I don't know how many there is. We'll count them when we get them loose. The way I like to do it is I'll take a 10mm wrench and just break them all loose. Get them all broke loose like that. And I'll take my gun and finish taking them out with a flex. I've got a flex drive extension. Alright, we got that one loose. Basically this half is done. I'm going to move to the other side. I'm going to pick up where I left off here. Breaking them loose. I'm just breaking them loose with the wrench. You can use a gun. Different people's going to do it different ways. This is just works good for me. And when I tighten them back up, I like to just run them up with the gun and snug them, and then I come back with my wrench and tighten them by hand. So I know I'm not over tightening them. So you should have them all. That should be all of them. And something else I like to go ahead and do before we take the cover off. This is your clutch free play adjustment. You want to break that loose and make sure it's not froze up. I like to pull these bolts out that's holding the cover on. I got them all loose. And got lucky on this one. That clutch free play wasn't froze up like they normally are. That 14mm nut just is acting like a lock nut. So this flathead, this is a stud that goes through this cover. The cover's not threaded. It's just a through hole. This stud just spins inside of the cover. There's a threaded plate on the inside that's a separate piece. Basically how this works is when you turn this stud one way or the other, it moves that plate in or out. That's how you get your, they call it free play. You see how it says, well, it says play, increase, decrease. And I think the book calls for, when you set it, a 1/4 inch. I like to set them at a 1/2 just to give you a little bit more play in there, because how the clutch is designed, the plates inside the basket, as they wear, it takes away from the free play. They work their way toward the front of the cover, which tightens up. And if this gets too tight, that adjustment, it can cause the clutches to slip and it'll burn them up. So we're going to loosen, what you want to do to loosen the free play, so we got that nut broke loose, we're going to spin this stud clockwise like that, which should be increase. The arrow on the cover, we're turning it in the increase direction. Just a couple turns just to make sure it's loose like that. Alright, we're going to bust these, got all these bolts here. See, I got a flex drive on my gun. I have 4 different length bolts. These 2 right here by the oil filter housing are a good bit longer than the rest. Alright, so all these bolts are loose. So these 2 here, yeah, they're real long. That's your 2 long ones. They're the same length. They go right there by the oil filter housing. And you just start pulling bolts out. Don't worry about, you ain't really got to worry about keeping up where they come from. Like I said, they're all gonna be the same length except for 2 where the alignment dowels are. And you can kind of tell if you've got a bolt in the right place on these Hondas. You always have about a 1/2 inch. Before you start your boat, you should have about a 1/2 inch of bolt hanging out of the hole. That's how you know if it's the right length for that hole. So what I do is I take a dead blow hammer. It's a dead blow. It's not a ball peen, because you can break this cover real easy. And I'll kind of tap on that cover. And if you listen, you can kind of tell when the cover will get loose. It'll change how it sounds when you're tapping on it. Do that on both sides. We're just breaking the seal. It's already broke loose. We're breaking that gasket maker seal there. So at this point, we've got it loose. It's about ready to come off. So I'll just take my hammer and pop it like that. Just try to come straight off with the cover, as straight off as you can. Just that, oh, that seal. That seal's trying to grab in that output shaft groove right there. So I'm gonna just kind of take and tap. I'm not tapping on the cap, I'm tapping on that lip of that cover right there. What's happening is the seal, where this thing is kind of new, the seal's trying to grab on that output shaft. There we go. I like to take these out. You may hear some stuff fall down in there, but it's going to do that. So we want to take this cover out from the other side. All right, if you have any pieces drop out, grab them. This is some your clutch actuator pieces that just kind of, they float in there. I'm going to show you how all that goes back together. There's one piece of it that fell out. Just put it to the side. I'm going to take this cover out from the right side if you're sitting on the machine. It gives you more room, I feel like. Alright, what I like to do is I'm going to take this cover and I'm gonna set it off to the side and let it drain. I'm gonna put it inside with this side down and let the oil drain out of it, because you got oil sitting in the oil filter housing. It makes seal pullers and stuff for popping these seals out, but you can do it with a flathead screwdriver. Just be careful. I go in there in between the seal and there's a shoulder on the inside, and kind of twist. Just work your way around. Just kind of take your time with it and work your way around, and it'll come out just like that. When we put this cover back on, we don't put the new seal in it yet. We get the cover back in place, then we slide the new seal over the shaft into the cover. It keeps from damaging the new seal. So we're gonna let that sit there and drain while we're getting the clutches out. Okay, so we've got the cover off. That piece that fell out, that clutch actuator piece. Basically, the way this works, you've got this arm, this shift arm. This goes on the shift shaft. This is a separate piece from the shaft. I'll pull it off here in a minute. That piece that fell out, this round side that kind of swivels, basically how this works, that fits inside of this bearing, and then this upside down U-shape rests on that roller. And the way this thing works is when you change gears, you can see this trying to move. This arm basically moves side to side, left to right. And what happens is, you see these detents, there's a ball bearing piece that's inside the cover, and this basically wedges. When you shift it, it wedges. This pushes in on that rear pressure plate inside of here, which breaks these plates. It allows these plates to break loose. That's where you get your clutching from. Basically, it's an automatic clutch. It's built into the shifting mechanism. So that's how that fits on there when you go to put it back together. So that comes off. Our bearing come out that time with it. You can go ahead and pull these pieces out so they don't fall out and run away from you. It'll be aggravating here. I'm gonna have to get a magnet. I got it. Alright, come on now. Alright, so that piece, the bearing fits inside of that. Just put all this stuff to the side. So you got all your loose pieces. Take your thumb and push against this shift shaft and pull on this arm. We got to take this arm to get it out of the way. We got to take it off. And you can kind of pay attention to how this is made. There's a spring in here that fits over a pin. It's like a split spring, and it has to go on here a certain way, so you can kind of look at how it's designed and fits on there as you're taking it apart, because it's got to go back together that same way. And you want to kind of take your finger. Let me set this down. There's another piece in here that tries to come off with the shift arm, but it's not supposed to. It needs to stay in here. So I'm gonna hold it with my finger, this plate here. I'm gonna keep it in place as I pull this off. And you'll see this shifter drop down when I pull this off. Just like that. Because that shift shaft, you see that shift shaft spinning, is directly tied to the shifter here. So I'll show you how this stuff goes back together. We'll take more time and explain it when we're putting it back together. So now, with everything out of the way, make sure you keep up with your alignment dials I was talking about. So there's one right here. You can see there's no threads in that hole. There's threads in there, but they're further back. So you've got a longer bolt that goes there. That dial stayed in the cover. And here's another one sticking out. It's just a little metal cylinder. It's called a dial. Just make sure you keep up with those. I like to take them out. Take a little pair of needle nose pliers, and you should be able to, normally they'll come out fairly easy if it's not a real old motor. I keep them to the side. That way when you clean, they're not in the way when you're cleaning these gasket surfaces. So now we're ready to take the clutches out. These are 27mm nuts. Regular right hand thread on these, on this model. So I use a gun we'll use the impact gun to pop them off, because this stuff will want to turn, see? So it's kind of hard to hold it in place if you're doing it, you know, with a hand tool or something. A gun will just zip it right off. Centrifugal clutch, make sure this one looks good. It hasn't really had any heat in it. You want to check this stuff. This is what wears when you run big tires without a gear reduction. It wears these shoes in here, so you can get grooves worn in the drum, and the pads themselves will wear down. We'll explain that more when we get it all out, and I'll show you what to look for. This is 27 millimeter, and depending on what you're trying to use to get it loose, you may have to try a different combination of sockets and swivels or whatever to get in there. So that one's loose. So there's a washer behind that nut, and it helps if you've got a magnet to get in there to get it out. You'll take this telescopic magnet here and just grab that washer and pull it out just like that. Alright, so now we're ready to thread. It's going to be hard to tell, but there's threads. You see the threads on the crank, but there's also threads, a larger diameter thread on the backing plate of the clutch assembly. And your puller, when you thread it on there, that's the correct way to pull this off, because you're pulling on the center of this assembly. A lot of people will try to use like a 2-jaw puller and come on the outside of the drum. That's not the correct way to do it. Yeah, it may work, but you actually could bend the drum or warp the drum in the process. You're supposed to pull on the center of that assembly where those threads are. Got a special puller here. We sell these. Just make sure your bolt is backed out about all the way, so it's not interfering with threading it onto the clutch. That threads onto that backing plate. And the way I like to do is I'll just run it on. You ain't got to tighten this up with a wrench or nothing. I actually like to run it on by hand and kind of snug it and back it off about a half a thread, and that helps keep the puller from kind of getting stuck onto that backing plate, because you'll have to use a wrench to get it back loose if not. Use an adjustable wrench on these flats on the puller itself to hold it. I went ahead and grabbed, I think this is a 3/4. Yep. You just want to tighten this. You're acting like you're tightening a bolt up. And what it's doing is it's gonna, that clutch has got a spline, and it's splined to the crankshaft, and it's like a press fit. So this is actually pressing against the end of the crank and pulling that clutch off of those splines. Alright, so we're free off the crank now. I like to back that back out and see how I can get this back off by hand, because I didn't run it all the way up there and snug it up. Let's grab this whole assembly. You don't have to take this clutch assembly will come out of the drum, but you don't need to take that out unless you're inspecting it. But this one's fine, I can tell, because it doesn't even have any heat marks in the drum. I'm gonna grab this whole assembly and come off just like that. We'll set this to the side. These are nuts are staked from the factory, and we're gonna restake them when we put them back on. You have to kind of hold that basket with your hand. So different. You can't mix these nuts up. They're 27 millimeter on the outside, but the clutch basket nut has got a smaller thread. So see, it won't screw onto these threads on the crankshaft. So you can't mix them up. Now there's another washer in here. We'll get it out with our magnet. Now this clutch here is not pressed on, it's just slip, it's got a slip fit. So at this point, this basket should just slide right off of that transmission shaft. Grab the whole assembly and work it off. Now there's a bushing, see it tried to come out. That bushing needs to stay you're going to transfer it over to your other clutch basket. Pull your small gear off, drive gear. There's a washer inside here. You're not going to run that washer, so leave it out. The reduction's designed to not run this washer. So you're done with this. I'm going to put that to the side. This clutch pack will slip up. At this point, should just slide right up out of the basket, just like that. Alright, there's a thin washer inside of here. You need to keep up with it. Put it in your reduction basket. You have to keep that washer. It keeps the so this is aluminum. That keeps the aluminum from seating up against the aluminum basket, because this has to spin freely against the basket in here. So you need that thrust washer for friction purposes, so you don't have that aluminum pressure plate rubbing against the aluminum basket in here. So keep up with that. Now we're going to show you how to swap these springs out, the stage 1 springs, for this 40% reduction. This cover over here drain. Now you're ready to clean it. I like to use a little wire brush because it doesn't really damage. It's going to kind of maybe scratch the aluminum a little bit, but it's not going to remove any material. But it'll kind of grab, see that piece of gasket maker? It'll kind of grab all that stuff and get it off. And you want to get all that stringy, all them stringy pieces, that excess, you want to get all that off. You don't want it floating in there. Here's your 2 dowel pins I was talking about, your alignment dowels. I'll go on the inside and the outside and grab it. Normally they should just come right out just like that. So take both of those out and kind of set them to the side until you're ready to put it back together, so you can clean your surfaces real good. This is the threaded part I was mentioning earlier. There's your ball bearings. That all stays with the cover. So what happens is when you spin this stud out here, some dirt. I'm going to try to do it by hand. So when you're spinning that with your screwdriver, I don't know if you can tell, moving that plate in and out. Just make sure, if you got this thing loose, that it stays lined up on this guide pin here. You want to back it off too far and get it off like that. And you don't want to put it back together like that. It's got to be on that guide pin. So make sure you run your bolt in enough that it can't come off in between, you know, having the cover off and putting it back in place. You want some play on it about like that. Alright, so we've cleaned the case, we've cleaned the cover, we've got all our Permatex gasket maker off. I took some brake cleaner, I sprayed out everything real good. Make sure we don't have any dirt, you know, from taking stuff apart. Which I didn't mention it, but we pressure washed. We washed this thing real good after we took the floorboards and the skid pan off. I always pressure wash them to get any dirt, loose dirt and stuff off of the engine. Make sure your O-ring, if it came out, make sure it's still in place right here. This is a water jacket for your coolant. That's where it goes through the water pumps it up through the head, the cylinder and the head. Make sure that O-ring is still there. You've got a little O-ring that stayed on this dowel. Make sure that's in place. Then I've got the 2 alignment dowels. I'm going to put them back in place. You want to put these, make sure you put these in the engine case and don't leave them in the cover. Because what can happen is when you go to put the cover on, if for whatever reason the cover doesn't go right on, you have to pull the cover back off or something. Like something's not lined up in here with the clutches. What can happen is that dowel can kind of stay, it can get pulled out and it'll fall down into the engine if you're not careful. So I always like to put them in the case when I'm putting it back together. Then you've got to make sure your O-ring, you've got a dowel and an O-ring. These always stay in place, what they do with me when I take them apart. You've got a little bit larger dowel and O-ring over here. This is your oil pump. Make sure all that is still in place. Everything's in place. Our bushing, we just left our bushing on the primary transmission shaft there. When I do these things, I like to have it where the engine is tilted back if I'm doing a primary. So I've got this thing, we've got it jacked up the engine's kind of tilted back some, so that any kind of oil or anything that's still sitting in here, because you won't ever get it all out, it's not trying to run out the front of the engine here while you're putting it back together. Because what can happen is if you get some oil trying to run out, like if the engine's tilted forward or something, you'll have some oil trying to run out constantly, and it can get into your gasket maker down here when you're putting it back together, and mess your seal up with your gasket maker, because that's got to be clean, oil free. Springs out, these 4 springs, we're going to put the stiffer springs in here. And I'm going to show you a little trick, because this is where a lot of people mess up. So this plate here, this outer pressure plate is what I call it, and you got an inner pressure plate. Alright, that's a separate piece. This hub part here that's splined is actually your outer pressure plate. It fits through this bore in the inner pressure plate. The inner pressure plate is what your 4 bolts are threaded into. You can see the threaded hose there. So that's a separate piece. These are separate pieces. But what's going to happen is when you take these bolts loose, that inner pressure plate's going to want to fall down, and there's notches on the outer and inner plate that locks them together, that lines up, and those notches can get out of alignment, and it'll keep your clutch plates from clamping together tight. And what happens if you don't catch that and you put it all back together, the machine's not going to move. The clutches are going to be slipping, so you have to go right back into it and fix it. So I'm going to show you a little trick here to kind of help that. You basically just want to lay something in there that's going to keep that plate from wanting to fall down. And the key is to kind of keep all those clutch plates in their grooves. That may be good enough, so we'll see how that works. And I'll just go ahead and back 2 of them across from each other all the way out. Then work these other 2 out a little bit at a time. Just like that. Pull that out. Take your springs out. We've got our stage 1 springs here. They're stiffer than those factory springs. So we're just going to set our plate right back on there. And I just start the same way I took it apart. I'll run 2 down a little at a time. Actually, a good thing to do is go ahead and try to get them started where they're pulling that plate down just a little bit, and then go ahead and pull this assembly back out, because at this point you've got that inner pressure plate pulled back into place. So we want to make sure that nothing moved, so we don't have a gap. See, our plates are tight. If those notches had gotten out of alignment that I was talking about, you'd have play. These plates would have play in them. So we're good. So just set that right back in the basket and finish tightening the your bolts up. You just want to run these down until this plate is going to bottom out on the top of that threaded boss. You don't have to get them crazy tight. You basically want them to bottom out, like right there. So that bottomed out. I think there's a spec on this, like 9 foot-pounds, but the spring tension, I think, affects, that throws off. You can't really go off of that 9 foot-pounds because you got a stiffer spring in there. I just like to snug them up with a wrench. I like to snug stuff with a wrench so I can feel it. You just want these snugged up. They don't need to be crazy tight. The spring tension is going to keep them from backing off and coming loose. We got our springs swapped out, so we're going to go ahead and swap. Don't forget your washer there. This is our reduction basket here. You see the bigger gear on it. This is our 40%. You can see the difference in the size. That's the factory gear. This is Honda factory. This is the 40%. So we went bigger on that gear and we went smaller on the drive gear. Get this swapped over here. That should drop all the way down in the basket just like that. My drive gear, we're leaving that washer out, don't forget. So you see the difference, how much smaller the 40% is than the factory gear. So these are our, what we call cores. Send those back to us if you don't want to keep it, if you want your core charge back. I've got a little bit of oil inside this gear. Slide that on. And your clutch basket, sometimes it'll be a little aggravating to get it back on because your splines have to line back up. And what'll happen is, what you run into is that shaft tries to turn. You can put it in gear and keep that shaft from turning, but most of the time what I'll do is I'll just kind of keep pulling it back off and I'll rotate it. But basically you got to get those splines to line back up. There it went. You can tell when it's lined up because it'll go ahead and go on some. Alright, that's all the way on. Your gears should pretty much line up about perfect. The drive gear, if it's pushed all the way back, it will be off the back side of your basket gear just slightly, but the reason for that is, so this gear, this drive gear, when this is all put together, can kind of float in and out like this. So that keeps a full mesh. We actually machine our drive gears thicker than the factory gear by about 25 thou or so. So as it floats back and forth, it keeps a full mesh. This has to be able to float, and that's something else. When we put the centrifugal clutch back on, you want to make sure that drum has got some in and out play on it. Some people think they'll put it together and they'll notice that play, they think they've done something wrong, but the factory assembly also has that play. People just don't notice it when they're taking it apart. But it's got to have some in and out play so that this drive doesn't bind on the crank. When this engine is idling, basically in theory what's supposed to go on is this crank is spinning, this gear should kind of float, free float, until you give it some throttle, the clutch shoes grab, that starts spinning your drive, which spins the basket. But that is supposed to float at idle, and that's where you can, that's what allows it to idle in gear without having to have a clutch. So now we're ready to, I'm going to put this nut back on, that 27mm. If you'll notice, I don't know if you can tell, but there's a spot on the shaft where you have to stake that nut. There's like a keyway type cut in the shaft, and there's a flange on the nut where you stake it. Honda tells you to replace the nut whenever you do this, but we normally reuse them because it'll end up going in a different spot. You can tell where it was staked. Basically what it does is you bend this flange, bends that flange down, which kind of locks it in place. Basically it locks the nut onto the shaft into that keyway. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten this. I've got this nut kind of tightened by hand here. We'll go ahead and bump it with our gun. I don't know what the torque spec is on this. You can look it up in the manual. We normally just kind of bump it a couple times with our gun on like a medium setting. You've almost got to have, I've got a punch here that I've bent so I can get behind this plate like this, kind of at an angle. You just want to kind of knock that flange down into that keyway on that shaft. That's all you want to do. Just like that. So it's down into that keyway. That nut can't come loose. So now we're going to do the centrifugal clutch the same way. Alright, if you want to check your clutch for wear, you just pull this out. There's grooves in these shoes. You can see these grooves. those are like wear grooves. Basically, if it gets worn to where those grooves are kind of gone, you don't see the grooves, that means you need to replace the shoes. Or if you've been running a big tire without a reduction, normally these will be black. They'll be real black, and what happens is it works just kind of like a brake pad does. It gets glazed over, which is going to cause it to slip and not grab. These actually look real good. So if he's been running big tires, he hasn't run them much or hasn't had it in a bind yet. So all this looks real good. There's no groove in the drum. You can see, you know, the rings from the shoes, but there's no groove in there that I can feel. You can check your one-way bearing. You want to make sure this acts like the inner race on your one-way bearing. This is the that backing plate that your shoes are fitted to. This is actually acting like the inner race for your one-way bearing that's in here. So this bearing can come out and pull it out, but it has to go a certain way, and it has out road on the side that faces out, which is toward the front of the machine. You want to make sure that goes in. It says outside right there. You want to make sure it goes in the same way it comes out, because if you put this in here backwards, it's going to reverse how it works. And what's going to happen is, as soon as you put it in the gear, the machine's going to start trying to move without any throttle, which is not good. So you'll have to go back in it and fix it. Make sure you don't have any flats on those rollers, and look at your drum in there is acting like the outer race for this bearing. See, this is basically a bearing without races. So make sure there's no flat spots, because if you got some flat spots, or if you notice your machine is kind of coasting like it's in neutral when you let out the throttle, if you're going, you know, with some speed, probably what's going on is this one-way bearing is worn. This is where you get your engine braking from. That's the purpose of this. So all that looks good. I'm gonna put it back like it come out, where you can read outside. So outside means facing the outside toward the front. You'll have to kind of spin this to get it to go back in there. So how this should work is it should freewheel one way and it should lock the other way. See, it freewheels this way and locks the other way. So that engages when you let out the throttle. That locks it up and gives you your engine brake. So we're going to get those splines lined back up, kind of bump it on. Okay, a lot of people mess up right here. They'll put their nut on and they'll try to use the nut to pull this clutch assembly back onto the crankshaft. That's not the correct way to do it. You need to seat the clutch with a mallet or something back onto the crank before you tighten the nut. It's not designed, you can't actually strip that nut out. Or what can happen is, if you're going by the specs in the manual, it calls for a torque spec. Here you can actually, if you're trying to use the nut to tighten the clutch back into place, you can actually reach the torque spec before it pulls this clutch assembly back far enough, and you'll have a lot of play in and out. See, that's way too much play, because the clutch is not all the way back. So what I do is I take that 27mm socket, just use something so you make sure you're not going to damage the threads on the crank, and you're not going to damage the threads where the puller goes. Basically, you want a socket that's in between. That 27 works good. Alright, and if you'll listen, if you know what to listen for, you'll hear this thing as you tap it into place. You'll hear it when it bottoms out. Basically what you're doing is there's a shoulder. I don't know if you can see it. There's a shoulder right here on the crankshaft behind these splines. And how this thing is supposed to work is this face in here, which is that the face on the back of your shoe plate here, is supposed to seat against the shoulder on that crankshaft. That's how you know it's all the way back. That's the correct position of it. So that's why you have to knock this thing into place, make sure it's all the way back. Let's see if we can. Hear that difference? You can hear it when it bottoms out. It'll get real solid sounding. Only have a little bit of play in and out here, right there. That lets me know that that shoe assembly is all the way back. Now you can put your nut back on, tighten it, and restake it. Whenever you do this, make sure this spins one way and it locks the other way, and that you've got some in and out play on here. Because for whatever reason, some people, they'll leave that washer, they'll put the washer back behind the drive gear or whatever, and this will be in a bind and you won't have this in and out play. Well, that'll make it, as soon as you put it in gear, it's going to try to move because it's not allowing it to float anymore. Make sure our socket's straight. That's all you want to do. That's plenty tight right there. It's got a press fit on those splines, so it's not really going to be able to come loose anyway. And when you put the cover in place, there's a bearing in the cover that the end of the crankshaft fits into, so even if your nut comes loose, it can't really come off or fall down in the engine or anything like that. So now we're going to restake that crank nut, and you have to kind of turn the engine over to get it where it needs to be. So I've got the staked area over here where I can see it, and I'm going to use my punch. I'm going to go right there and I'm going to restake it. Just like that. Now we're going to put our clutch actuator parts back into place. We're going to put some gasket maker on the cover. I don't put any on the case, I just put it on the cover. It's kind of aggravating putting it on the case with everything in place. Okay, so this actuator arm, this shift shaft is splined, and there's splines inside of this arm, and it's keyed where it can only go on a certain way, but now you can force it on the wrong spot. So the trick to this is, what I like to do is I'll pick this shifter up. Most time the shifter is basically in line with the top of your foot peg right here, so see how it's down a little bit. So I'm going to kind of pick it up to where it's in line with the top of my foot peg, about like that. And then this arm, when it's in place correctly, it should line up directly center of the basket. It shouldn't be off one way or the other. It should come up directly through the center line of that basket. And it should just fall right into place on the shaft if it's on the right spline or keyed like it's supposed to be, the right indexing. And you may have to kind of play with it to find the right spot. Right there, see, it just fell right on. I had to kind of pick my shifter up above the foot peg, but that's just a little trick. And there's a tang on here. That tang is supposed to go between the two spring legs back here. That's on the, there's a pin, and basically this tang needs to go in between that spring. If you don't put this stuff back together right, it's not going to shift correctly. It's going to shift one way or the other, or not shift at all, or it's going to do something weird. All this has to go back just like it comes apart. So that's all the way back. See, our arm is running up directly center of the basket. Now you want to take this piece and you're going to set this back in the basket, just like you took it apart. These things are always kind of tight. You may have to take a hammer and tap it in there. They've got a snug fit to them. Okay, I got it to go with my hand. And that fits in there. That saddle is just going to kind of sit on that roller, and that's how that thing works. When you shift it up or down, it pivots one way or the other. Alright, so now basically this is ready for the cover to go back in place at this point. So we're gonna put Permatex on our cover and get it ready to go back on. Putting our gasket maker on our cover. We cleaned this with brake cleaner. I like that red, the CRC, what I prefer to use. Main thing is make sure you got all the old gasket maker off. You can tell, you can see the gasket maker on the surface, so you can kind of tell when you've got it all off. This stuff here, it doesn't take a real, just a thin coat of this is all you want. This stuff that we use is kind of runny, but it sits up real fast. As soon as you can get all this bolted back together, you can crank it up and run it. It's kind of runny, so you don't have to use a lot of it. You just want a thin, even coat. Just make sure you don't miss any spots as far as from the inside to the outside. Go all the way around your bolt hose. Don't go around just the outside. You want to go all the way around your bolt hose. Just a thin coat like that is all you want. Got the oil seal out. We're not going to put the new one in until we get the cover back in place. Because if you try to put the seal in first and put the cover on, you can actually damage that new seal. It'll pull the spring out of the inside of it. And you've got to take the cover back off. So we're showing you pretty much the best way to do everything. Alright, so that's ready to go back on. The only other thing you got to make sure of when you do this, okay, this is your water pump drive shaft. That drives off a pin inside of the camshaft. So what I always do is I'll visually line this up with a bolt hole or something on the cover, and I'll do the same thing with the pin in the cam. So I'm going to line it up with this small dowel that's got that little O-ring around it. This is the top side, so when this cover's in place, it's going to sit like this. So that's that water jacket hole with the big O-ring. This is the dowel pin beside it with the small O-ring. So we're going to line our cam pin up with it. Okay, so this pin is what drives that water pump shaft. So you have to make sure it's lined up and indexed for the slot in the shaft. So we've got our shaft lined up with this dowel hole here with that small O-ring. So I'm going to rotate the engine and get that lined up. It doesn't have to be perfect, just kind of close. So we want that lined up pointing toward that dowel like that. Because if you try to put that, that's another place where people mess up, they won't catch that. They'll have this out of alignment with the shaft, they'll try to beat the cover on and they'll break this pin or they'll break the shaft. Then you've got to replace parts that you didn't need to. That looks pretty close there. Okay, we've got everything clean. We've got our gasket maker on our cover. Just, I always like to double check right here before I put the cover back on. Make sure you don't have any oil dripping off this area. If you do, spray some brake cleaner off and wipe it off good. That'll mess up your seal. And I just feel like I've got more room. I guess because of this water pump area, it seems like it's more aggravating to take the cover off from the left side than it is taking it off the right side. It's easier if you've got two people to put this cover back on, but best thing I can tell you is you just kind of try to line it up by eye how it needs to sit. Kind of like that. You'll have to kind of play with it. They never just fall right on. And the cover, when you get it on and it's on right and everything's lined up, it should just go right on just like that. You shouldn't have to beat it on or knock it on or nothing. You may notice just a little gap in there before you get the bolts in it, but that's because of the O-rings holding it off. But if you've got like an 1/8 inch gap or something, there's something in there not right. That's what you want right there. So now we're ready to put our bolts back in. I'm gonna run them up with the gun and the flex extension, snug them up, then I'm gonna go back with my 10mm wrench and tighten them by hand, just snug them good. Okay, we got our cover back on. We've got all our bolts back in place. I do want to mention that on this, the way they designed it, your alignment dowels still run the same length bolts as the rest of these bolts. The only two that's different length are the two over here. by the oil filter housing. They're kind of real long. So those two are long. All the rest of these bolts are the same length. We've run them up with the gun and snugged them up, and I just like to come back with my wrench and just kind of snug them up with the wrench, so I know that they're not over tightened.
These probably have a torque spec of like 9 foot-pounds or something. Check the manual if you're worried about that.
I'm just doing a real good snug, what I would call it. All right, all those are tight. So we've left our we left the seal out because it's easier to put this on. Well, basically all we're going to do is we're going to put this on. We're going to install it. This allows you to be able to kind of work it over that shaft, that shoulder. So these shoulders can grab the inside lip of this seal. There's a spring in here. If you're not careful, if it grabs that lip of that seal and pulls it, it can pop that spring out of place, which is not good. So this allows you to you can kind of put some oil. There's grease inside of the seal, so that's going to kind of give us some lubrication to put it in place. They come with grease in them, and you can kind of just tell if it's trying to pull. You'll kind of have to angle it and kind of work it over those shoulders. So at this point I'm going into the cover. I'm over my shoulders, my grooves, so I'm not worried about those. Now I'm gonna get a deep well socket that fits this seal pretty good, and I'm gonna just knock it into place with my dead blow. Basically I'm gonna use this deep well 27. It fits, it doesn't try to hit my shaft or anything. It's got plenty of room inside there, and it fits good on the seal. So I'm gonna just take my dead blow mallet, and I'm gonna just kind of, should just kind of knock in place real easy. There we go. So I've got it sitting just kind of slightly below flush. Now, don't forget your O-ring. Put you some grease on it. If it doesn't have any grease on it, that'll help it all kind of slide back together easy. I'm gonna get some grease out of this coupling in this diff and grease that O-ring. Put it back on. At this point, you need to, what I always like to do now, once I got the cover bolted back on, we've got that O-ring on so we don't forget it. I'm gonna go ahead and set the clutch free play. So we'll show you how to do that right quick. Okay, so the correct way to set this free play is obviously you want this thing to be spin real easy inside of there. Sometimes they'll be froze up, it'll oxidize inside of this cover. We actually we sell a new bolt, a new Honda bolt, if you end up damaging yours or having to take it out or cut it or whatever, because a lot of times they're froze up. This one actually wasn't, which is like very rare. So we actually sell a replacement bolt on the website with some different hardware that allows it to keep it, basically it'll keep this bolt from getting froze up in the future. So you want to spin this counterclockwise, which is the decrease direction, until you feel it snug it right here. It's snugging up on me. It doesn't want to spin, it's tightening up. So what's happened is when you turn this counterclockwise, you're pushing that plate that was in the cover, you're pushing it up against the clutch pack. So you want it to snug up against the front of the clutch pack right there. And then I like to come off a half a turn. That's a half turn. And then lock that 14mm nut back. And you don't have to get crazy with that, just snug it up. It just kind of keeps that stud from working loose and moving. You'll have to hold the screwdriver kind of in place and snug that nut up. That's the proper setting, half a turn. That'll keep your, if that is set too tight, it'll make the clutches slip in there and it can burn them up. And if it gets set too loose, way too loose, when you shift it, it can actually get that inner and outer pressure plate, it can actually get those out of alignment. And if it does that, you'll have to pull the cover back off to fix it. So you got to be real careful. It's something simple, but if it's not set correctly, it can cause a lot of headache. So we've got that. Now we're just going to hook our coolant lines back up. Don't forget to unclamp them. Put your drive shaft back in place. Basically, you're just going to do everything the opposite of how you took it apart. Make sure you got your drain plug in place. These foot shifts take 3 liters of oil to fill them up if you don't change the filter. So put 3 liters in there and check it. Your DCTs, which is the auto with the push button shift, take 4 liters. And the DCTs are similar. They're a different design, but it's a similar process as far as doing a primary reduction like what we've done here. That's pretty much it. Just do everything in reverse of how you took it apart at this point. And ride it, make sure we don't have any leaks. I always ride it, make sure everything is working and it's shifting through all the gears before I put all the floorboards and plastics back on. Make sure we don't have any leaks. Then you can put your floorboards and stuff back on.